So I continue to read and hear that there are a lot of people who are concerned about the balance negative, so I wanted to stop and share just a few more thoughts, what I think you can do on the affirmative that can make the balance negative a lot more difficult to win. And I know I've talked a lot about how to debate the topic on the affirmative, and I haven't talked very much about approaches to the negative, and I do plan to rectify that in the next week or two. But just today, let me talk a little bit about what you can do in the affirmative constructive and then be ready with in the rebuttals in case there's someone who is very successful with the balance negative. I think in the first speech, right after you define whatever terms you choose to define, you should do something very commonly done in LD, and you should say, so here's my interpretation of the topic. The topic is talking about a dynamic setup of relationships where there are multiple factors at work, and it is asking which of these is dominant. This is an explanation you've heard out of me before, but I think you ought to put it into the affirmative constructive. Say the question the resolution asks, the resolution stipulates, begins from the assumption that cooperation and competition coexist, but it asks, where there is excellence, which of those has been dominant? And as the affirmative, I see as my ground defending that competition is dominant over cooperation where excellence has been achieved, and I see as the negative's ground defending that cooperation is dominant over competition. You might even describe it, and the ground that I think this sets you up for, you might want to include this illustration in the affirmative constructive, or you might want to hold on to it for the rebuttal in case the negative tries a balance strategy. I think what you do is you give some examples of situations in which people have to figure out which out of a number of different competing causes was the dominant one. And I have a couple of illustrations that might help you with this concept. An insurance adjuster. I used to live down near Louisiana, and I lived through Hurricane Katrina, and a lot of insurance adjusters had to come out to people's homes, and because of the way the insurance policy was written, they had to determine which caused the most damage. Was it the wind, or was it the water? And the fact that the house obviously had been damaged by both, well, the adjuster couldn't just leave it at that. They couldn't say both contributed and they interacted and I can't figure out which one, so I'll just say both. Well, that wasn't open to them. They had to determine which one so they could determine how much they needed to pay on the claim. Similarly, when the highway patrol has to figure out what caused a single vehicle accident, they may need to ask, was it driver error? Was it the design of the car? Or was it the design of the road? And in certain cases, they may collect all the evidence and say we can't determine what the cause of the accident was, but that's never, ever their first resort. What they're very likely to do is to establish a probable cause of the accident. It is more likely that this was driver error, or it is more likely that the road was at fault, that this is just an unsafe curve, or it's more likely that it was the design of the vehicle. And here's where you can talk about what is at stake. Why the balance negative is fundamentally a cop-out. In those situations, it's not okay to say they all contributed, because if the dominant contributing factor was the design of the car, then that car needs to be recalled. And if that gets covered up just because they say that, well, all the different factors contributed, well, that's an important question that remains unanswered. Now, both of those examples are negative examples, so they may not translate all that well to whether competition or cooperation lead to excellence, because that's a positive, not a negative situation. So the illustration you might want to use is a pharmaceutical researcher. What if a pharmaceutical researcher finds a substance that seems to kill a certain disease germ or seems to treat a certain health condition, but that substance has got multiple discrete elements to it, and the researcher needs to figure out which element is it that's therapeutic, which element is it that takes sick people and makes them well. And there's this really, really kind of horrible story that you can Google, and I think you could use this as an illustration. Massengill, a very long time ago, they released, around the 1930s, they released a substance onto the market, elixir sulfanilamide. Now, sulfanilamide is a very effective drug. I think it's an antibiotic. But what they had done is they'd mixed it with antifreeze. And people who were taking it were dying because they hadn't bothered to separate out what was the element that actually cured people, and they had mixed it in with a deadly poison. And you can find a few descriptions of this entire event if you go and look it up. And that's the kind of thing that I think could help you establish the idea where there are multiple factors and you need to nail down what is the factor that contributes most to the effectiveness. It's not okay to say, well, the whole substance does and I'm just not going to separate out the causes. Then what I think you can do, I think if the negative tries to go ahead and argue their balance negative anyway, I think that what you need to do is you need to stock up 4 or 5 reasons for the affirmative rebuttal why Opting out of the question, saying the question is unanswerable, is not acceptable. I think maybe you begin, and you're going to have to think of the rest of them. I only have the one suggestion. I think you begin by saying it is counter to the spirit of philosophical inquiry, and that if the negative is allowed this option, then value debate that brings in philosophers, may as well not exist, that this does violence to what philosophy is all about. Philosophy doesn't leave complex questions unanswered. It pursues those questions. It doesn't say all the factors interplay and we'll just leave it at that. It determines the nature of each one of those factors. So I think the approach of calling it a complex question and that the point of the topic is separating out the factors and arranging them in a hierarchy and figuring out which one is dominant, and the importance of that in understanding the situation. The fact that that's the definition of analyzing a situation, I think that gives you a lot of good, very appealing ground that you'll be able to pitch and sell to a judge. So give that some thought, and good luck to you.